All
Perfect.
right, man. All right. So here we go. We are recording. All right. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Onyango Otieno. Onyango, welcome. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Guy.
So since there's very little information, next to none, about the models of healthy masculinity, my guest today, Onyango, began a podcast that tackles the complexities of African masculinities, from culture to religion to politics to the historical underpinnings of what informs the African man's perception of himself and his environment, and how these perceptions affect the day-to-day goings-on of his country and the African continent in terms of economy and social health. Having grown up in a violent home with an abusive father, men have always made Onyango curious, and it's his aim to get other men curious about who they are in order to help advance research for better policies and the understanding of sexual and reproductive health and rights. So, wow, heavy duty, man.
I just heard that. I was like, oh my God, is that me?
Yeah, that's intense stuff. First of
It
all,
isn't.
where are you calling from?
Nairobi, Kenya.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much for doing this. So how did this, let's get into it. You know, before we started recording, you were like, let's do it. How did this start for you?
It started from my home. My dad was just nuts. He was extremely violent towards my mother and I, and I was really physically abused and emotionally abused on so many layers. And then I was at the same time simultaneously curious about the goings on around what was happening in my environment, in that my father came from a polygamous home. And so with our villages back then here, like up country now, we'd go there on like December holidays, and I was really just curious to see why my aunties were nearly always crying and they were sad many times. I
So
would
how old were
witness,
you at this point you're
I
talking
was
about?
around 7, 8, 9, 10.
Okay.
And seeing how violent my uncles were on top of my father's own violence, it really just something just sounded like it was amiss somewhere. But it was the consistent and very persistent violence in my own home, my father against myself and my mother, that just it messed me up properly. So one day I remember I was 10 years old, 1998, somewhere in June. He came back home. He was looking for a Bill Cosby novel, and he couldn't navigate it because he was a teacher. Both my parents are teachers. And we live in a single room in Nairobi Eastlands area. And so, I mean, in a single room, if something is not in the four corners of that house, it's not there. So, being that I was the only person who was going to school, my father sort of insinuated that I probably was the one who took the novel. Now, as a young boy, I mean, I would still, in Kenya, our currency is shillings. So I would steal things like 5 shillings, which I don't know how much that is in US dollar. I have no idea. But it was like really little money to just buy small things like sweets and biscuits. So for me, stealing a novel was like a bank heist, because where would I take a novel at 10 years old? I wasn't such a reader, and I didn't really like books by that time, because home still felt like another school, because it was always about get your homework done, make sure you study hard, come be top 3, top 2 student in class. And I mean, I was looking for every opportunity not to read because it was some kind of protest, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so my father started beating me up because he was almost sure that I was the one who took up this book. Um, and he started beating me up with like these hard telephone copper wires. Like they have
Mm-hmm.
this copper that has really tough rubber on it. And he strips me off naked and starts beating me up. And I was like, I had a really small body. And my father would beat you with his soul, like with every single cell in his body. He would really, really like rain his blows on you. And so this went on for like 10, 15 minutes. And My mother was there watching helplessly. I was screaming, I was shouting, and I had started bleeding already. I was sweating, I was crying. And I started feeling like my body was going out of strength. And something like my little child intelligence told me, yo, today we have to lie we did something we didn't do just because we are not sure where this guy is taking us tonight.
Mm-hmm.
um, because it was a book he had borrowed a student he used to tutor. So it was probably really also important to him and to the child. But the way he was communicating that importance of the book was just incredibly hard, because the thing was, he was like, can your mother steal a book? Can the housekeeper steal a book? You're the only person who goes to school here, so
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't make sense, you know. So I told him that I took the book, and then he walks out of the house. He comes back. I'm still naked on the floor, bleeding, crying, and he comes back with a slice of rope as if he had planned all this, and he ties my hand with them. And then he goes to the little kitchen we had, and he tells me that he's gonna do something to me. His words were, "I'll do something to you that you'll never forget." So he comes back with a paraffin jerry can. I don't know which you use, paraffin or kerosene. I don't know which of the two.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, and he smears some of it on my left hand. And he came with a matchbox as well, and he just lit up a matchstick and put it on my left hand.
Oh my God.
And that was just insane. I felt like something had broken inside me that to this date I've never really gotten the words to explain. But that child pure innocence, something just broke, you know. I felt really violated. I've never been the same since, and this is what, 22 years later. But this I remember I couldn't walk for 2 weeks. My body was frail. My mother tried to nurse me. But this violence did not stop even after that. Like the next 5 years, up to when I was 15, 16, now it was getting out of hand. They were still fighting at home. I was getting to my high school. And now as a way of protesting or screaming for help, I used to run away from home. So I'd become a street child, go steal, like what is it called, shoplift things like milk to survive in the streets. And sometimes I'd be found and people would beat me up, like mob justice. And it's just a miracle that I survived, really, and somehow found a way back home. And I started writing during those years. Now that's when, like, I was in so much pain, I felt I needed to get things out. And
Mm-hmm.
I felt like if I didn't do that, I was gonna die. And so that's where the writing began. And I started by doing poetry in the beginning, but it was inspired by another story that happened to me when I was 7 years old. I had a sister who died when she was 6 months old. And so I imagined at this time, which I was having a hard moments, if she was alive, she'd have been there for me. Being the firstborn in my home, the brother who follows me is like 7 years behind. So when I was 16, he was such a young kid. I couldn't really talk to him about what I felt and my emotions. So the imagination of my sister, who I was also now properly mourning as a teenager, was my inspiration to start writing poetry. And just, I remember the title was A Letter to the Grave. And it, another poem came after that, and another poem came after that. So as I grew older, my voice grew stronger, I grew bolder. And the scope of masculinity that was being forced down upon me was everything I was watching in the movies. Like, men were these tough people who had to be muscular, they had to be controlling, they had to have all the women, they had to be cool, but none of them was expressing their emotions. It just, so much disconnect. And I was trying to connect with something, but it didn't cut.
Mm-hmm.
And what's off, my father was like still the people I was watching on TV. And I just couldn't connect with that. And so I began my own quest. I really wanted to live a different life. And I knew from that young age that that wasn't what I wanted. I didn't want the violence. I didn't want to control people. I wanted to be free, and I wanted everybody around me to be free. I wanted my mother to be free. So I remember an incident in 2015. I think I was around 20, 25, 26 years old. My parents were fighting again. And this time I made an attempt, which most times I like to call it like a suicide mission, to call your parents down for a meeting. You don't do that here. And, I talked to my father separately and my mother separately about just what's happening in the family. And because I was just tired of everything. So I remember one statement my father made that changed my life completely. And it was probably one of his most vulnerable moments ever with me. He said, he doesn't come to me with his problems because I'll think he's weak. And that was it for me. I imagined, how much pain must this man be in that he actually thinks if he comes to me, his child, with his reality, that I'm going to treat him less of a man, right? And what made him imagine that all those years I lived in that house, that I never saw his weaknesses. In his brain, he imagines that I see him as always strong, always on top of things. But I've seen his weaknesses just by everything that would happen at home. So there was just so many gaps there that I really needed to understand. And so it's from that time that now I went back to understand his own child. And I realized, growing up in the polygamous home, his father was also violent.
Mm-hmm.
And his father would beat up his wives, he'd beat up everybody at home. And then I wanted to inquire where that came from. And I came to hear that my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, fought in the Second World War for the British in Burma. And when he came back, he definitely suffered a lot of post-traumatic stress, which nobody could pick up by those days.
Mm-hmm.
And this happened to so many African soldiers who were bundled back down to their villages, just the way they were taken from them. Because now I started hearing these stories from people about, men of that age who would imagine the war would still remain in their minds. So they would
Mm-hmm.
imagine the troops are coming, they tell everybody to bow down and stuff like that. Um, so I was like, yeah, I'm probably the first person in my clan who figured that out, that grandpa
Mm-hmm.
suffered PTSD and he became violent as a coping mechanism. And he suffered, like he struggled with alcoholism as well. So my father picked that up as trauma as well, which is just something he passed on to us. Yeah.
Let me, first of all, thanks so much for sharing that. I mean,
Yeah.
there's no two ways about it, Onyango. I mean, that is just so intense, and I'm just sorry that you had to go through that. What is your relationship with your father now?
We're not in good terms. We're not in good terms because he's still not been very kind to my mom and to most of us. And even through like me going through therapy, because it's something I do really often. One of the things I've had to confront is accepting, first of all, two things. One, I had to accept a lost childhood, a childhood which didn't go the way it was supposed to go.
Mm-hmm.
And the second one is to lose the anticipation of being close with my father, because I let that spirit, I let it go to the air. If it happens, good and well. If it doesn't, it's okay. So I used to live with too much hope and hoping, things could be different. He would change his mind. He would look at me and say he loved me. He would come back home and be kind to my mother. But those days were never coming. And I
Mm-hmm.
didn't want to get stuck in there, So I had to accept that it may not happen and it's okay.
Onyango, talk a little bit more about literally how you started your podcast and your mission. I mean, my guess is from what you're saying that what you're talking about here, the recognition of trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder and you know emotions and so forth, understanding them. And my guess is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that
Mhm.
this is not, I don't know, new. How is it being accepted in your community? Do people know what you're doing?
They do know because first of all, I've been writing for quite a long, like probably the last 7 years, especially through my 20s. But I used to write about gender-based violence for most parts because by then I had no idea to anything with mental health or trauma or all these words I know today.
Mm-hmm.
I would simply write about what I went through. I would tell the stories, this happened to me, this happened to me, this happened to me. So the term we had was gender-based violence. That was the closest thing I had, but I didn't know how it had affected my brain. I didn't know
Mm-hmm.
how it affected my behavior. I couldn't translate those things.
Right.
So the more I talked about it, the more I met people, the more I was exposed to these realities. But it wasn't until 2017 when I got into depression and I had suicide ideation again. And it had happened to me when I was 16 years old, and that feeling was so familiar. I knew it so well. I remember getting home. I was coming off a toxic relationship. I didn't have a job. I was feeling hopeless. I had lost two friends to suicide, and both of them were men, and they were like my age mates. I felt so hopeless, and I remember getting into my bathroom and showering for 2 long hours, just letting the water run down, asking myself, "So what am I gonna do to myself when I get out of this bathroom?" And for the longest time, writing has been that thing for me as that last minute light candle, the only remaining thing between me and death for most parts. And so I remember just getting out of the shower with my wet body and letting the water run because I was at near death. Like I felt like this is it. It's either I do something or I'm gonna do something nasty to myself. Like, I don't know, jump off the building or hang myself in the house or something. So I rushed to my laptop with my wet body, my wet hands, everything. And I opened up the laptop and I started writing. Guys, I'm feeling suicidal. I'm in depression. And this is what's happening to me. So that also just changed my life because I had previously been writing about the pain of growing up in an abusive home, but this time it went a bit more personal now. My brain was affected and
Mm.
that was different. So I did receive so much support, especially from, and women are usually a bit more empathetic around these stories because they live with men and children and boys who uh, go through these issues, but they do not know how to open up about them. In my circles, I did receive quite much support from the men around me. I have a very healthy, strong male network with my friends. Friends I've been friends with for the last 10 years. We've grown up literally together. But online, I mean, I could still see those nuances of people, men reacting like, this is too emotional. Who's gonna come save you if you cry like this online? Why didn't you just go ahead and do it, kill yourself? You
Mm-hmm.
know, you're a coward for not doing it. Actually, you're just coming here to tell us. I mean,
Right.
and I had been doing online writing for quite a bit of years. So I understood cyberbullying. I understood those kind of reactions. They didn't really get to me because for me, writing is that place that gives me freedom. So it gives me so much power. I'm not really
Oh.
fazed by what people say around this. So in early this year, 2020, at the onset of COVID-19, um, I was working with Green String Network to do trauma healing workshops for Kenya Police Service, who are it's a lot that is in a lot of mess.
Mm-hmm.
And we were doing the workshops and we were traveling around talking to these men and women in the service, which was an incredible experience. And then now with COVID, we couldn't do that anymore. So my time at home, I was feeling very anxious. The numbers were surging in Italy. It was spreading across Europe so fast. It got to the US, it got to South America. The numbers were crazy. We were a bit worried about what's going to happen in Africa. Are we going to die like that, because a lot of us, like our public healthcare systems, are really shambolic and very unstructured for most parts. So it was really confusing because it wasn't coming, like the deaths weren't really happening here as much as they were happening outside. So we didn't know what was going to happen. There was too much anxiety in the air, and I wanted to sort of have some kind of control over my life. So I switched everything off and just stayed at home and read my books, and I stopped working for a while. I had been meaning to start conversations with men around men issues. And so the idea just came right there. Also because there was surging sexual violence cases and intimate violence cases on a global perspective,
Mm-hmm.
and here as well. So the Ministry of Health reported that between mid-March and June, that we had 5,000 rape cases
Oh,
reported, which was intense.
right.
And 70% of the victims or survivors were girls of 18 years of age going down. And 95% of the perpetrators were men. Now, 5% of that number were men who had been violated both by men and women.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for most parts, we do not have enough structures to support um, either through psychosocial support or emotional support. We don't have any structures to help violated men go through some kind of healing. And so I was like, this is it. This is time. It's time to just start something.
Mm-hmm.
And it was still tied to my father. It was tied to my upbringing. It was tied to the men I was seeing on TV. It was tied to the men I was growing up around. I wanted to understand what is this thing that keeps us glued to the understanding that if you're not a violent man,
Mm-hmm.
either physically or emotionally, then you're not a man enough. What is that thing? And yet it's hurting so many people out here. We are hurting and we do not know how to express it. So I went back and I started reading and reading. So I have a couple of books which I'd been invested in that talks a bit about masculinity and manhood and all this. But I also realized I did not have enough resources to understand the African man and his real context, because our situations are also quite complex. And so I had to start looking for stories online from academic researchers, and the little books I could get that have been written by Africans around masculinity. They are really, really hard to come by. And connected that with what other writers from other places, especially from the global south, have been writing about masculinities in those places. And I just started the podcast. And so now I started with the audio, and I am currently crowdfunding to start the visual version of the same, because
Mm-hmm.
I feel right now the young African man does not have spaces or people to emulate who are healthy male figures they could learn from. They don't see those people on TV. Those people are not in their homes, they're not anywhere. So for me, this documentation is not only for the African young man right now, but it's also for the 25th century. When they'll be there
Mm-hmm.
looking back and looking for stories, they will find these stories online.
Let me just reintroduce you here. I'm speaking with Onyango Otieno. His podcast is African Masculinity Podcast. So a lot of therapists listen to this podcast. A lot of therapists of various kinds. What do you want them to hear? I mean, so we're talking about people who are working with their clients in a sense, but what is it important for them to hear, Onyango?
One of the biggest lessons I've learned over my advocacy work is the power of empathy. Empathy is so powerful. Empathy does not respect your social class or political class or religious class or any class for that matter. Empathy is such a pure human emotion that can free anything on this earth. And in this work of understanding trauma and talking to a lot of abused boys and men, I have learned empathy is the door that opens up healing, that people start feeling safe to come out. The wounded child, when they see empathy, they can learn to reconnect with themselves, with the outside world, with their environment. Their brains can start being rewired back to safety, back to love, back to growth, right? And so for me, that is the biggest message I always send. If somebody comes with a story, sometimes because we are human beings, it's easy to judge them. It's easy to even just meet them as the doctors we are, the therapists we are. It's easy to look at them in the lenses from our own cultures. Those things are very human. But I've also realized when we put empathy first before who we are, then we get an opportunity to humanize the other person in a way that we also learn so much from their own realities. We give them an opportunity to heal, to even own their own healing experience. And for me, that's the most powerful thing.
As we're talking, a lot of what's going on now in the United States is Black Lives Matter and the horrific tragedies that have been happening to Black men from the police and so forth. What is your take on how are you seeing that? Do you experience something similar? What is your take on what we're going through right now?
I mean, anywhere you are on this earth, just as long as you're Black, it's already a mark on you. Like already it's a mark. That's the first point. And the second point is here in Kenya, for example, we witness a lot of police brutality. And it was interesting because when COVID came here, the government imposed a curfew in the country. So we weren't allowed to be out, let's say by 7 p.m. So to enforce that, police were really beating up people, and some people were actually killed as well. And most of them were men, as it is in how it happens in protests. So it was interesting that just at the time when the Black Lives Matter movement spiraled up, we were also here with End Police Brutality. So they were really coinciding at the same time. And it was really painful, even just, watching the George Floyd video, because we could really relate to it here because of how the police, kill people here. But even beyond that, it is the structural everyday violence that happens to people that makes trauma such a complex thing. And this is universal, for Black men, especially Black men in the US, Black men anywhere on this earth. And here in Africa, just what we are fighting against is now sometimes ethnic enmity or political warfare, where people in this political class like steal all the funds and government resources, and the people below that class have to work too hard to fend for themselves and stuff like that. And all these things are connected from BLM to police brutality here. All these things are connected because it's a certain kind of people who feel they own the rights to oppress other people. That is just bottom line of it. And it has caused so much trauma, which we haven't even known how to start processing.
Right. And as we kind of wind down here, we're restricted by time in a sense. I'd love to have you back. I'd love to have you back, man, and continue this conversation. But what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Oh, so on Google, I'm really, somebody can just search Onyango Otieno.
Okay.
Onyango Otieno. It's just spelled the way I'm saying it.
Okay, I'll have it linked up too at the show notes page
cool.
here.
Yeah, or Rick's Poet. So Rick's Poet is RIXPOET.
Okay.
So any of those terms would lead you to my page, and any of them: LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram.
Okay. Awesome, man. Again, it was awesome talking to you and meeting you, and you're friggin' so inspiring, man. I love what you're doing.
Thank you for your podcast. Your podcast is really enlightening as well. You have no idea.
I appreciate that, Onyango. All right, man. We'll be in touch.
Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.
Soon.